This is Paul Shore, talking to Xiao-Jing Wang, one of our speakers in the summer school. And in your talk, you focus very much on the role of working memory, sustained activity, and in cognition. And you started with this fairly strong claim where you said that actually delay activity is the key to cognition. So why do you think this is the key ingredient that we should worry about?
Right. I guess the general idea is that imagine that you cannot hold in your mind anything in absence of direct sensory stimulation. Then it seemed to me that most of the repertoire of behaviors is going to be reduced to reflex. All you can do is, just reactively respond to stimuli right away. Otherwise, you wait, you forgot what was the stimulus, so you cannot really act accordingly, and you become enslaved to the external world. Whereas if you have this ability to hold something in your mind, even when the input is gone, then you are freed from the immediate stimulation, and so that you can become a lot more flexible, right? You can, for example, wait and decide what you do about the stimulus, and still remembering what was the stimulus.
Right.
Yeah.
And then as a implementation of this, you were pointing very much to cortical circuits. So what's so special then about cortical circuits that they can give you this kind of memory function?
Right. So in fact, persistent activity itself is probably more widespread than working memory related persistent activity. So I want to distinguish those two things. For example, even when you try to hold a gaze, right, your eyes are fixating on something, that's maintained by persistent activity in the oculomotor system outside of the cortex, right? But there's a very long history of studies pointing to the prefrontal cortex as a very important structure for working memory. So that date back to, 1920s and 30s, where people showed that if you do lesion of the prefrontal cortex, an animal like a monkey will not be able to do delayed response task, which depends on working memory. So from there on, I think, there's a lot of studies showing that prefrontal cortex is really important for working memory, and that's why there's a lot of focus on cortex.
But then you were saying that it is the special characteristic of this dense recurrence in these circuits that could sustain this memory function. Is that correct?
That's the idea. Yeah.
Okay, so then I could argue that actually this kind of dense recurrence I would find throughout the cortex. So why is then not my occipital cortex, that's usually more dedicated to vision, actually a working memory system showing sustained activity? What's then so special about these frontal areas that they can support working memory?
Right. So I guess empirically, we do not have enough, data to answer your question explicitly. But generally, it probably is a matter of degree, right? So we know even in the primary sensory areas, the majority of synaptic inputs are coming from within the local circuits. But maybe there's just more in the prefrontal cortex compared to sensory areas. And what's interesting from the computational point of view is that you can show that because of these feedback systems, your dynamics is nonlinear. And in nonlinear systems, I think it's very important that just some graded differences, some quantitative differences in, for example, in the amount of recurrent connections can lead to qualitatively different behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if your recurrent connections is, below a threshold level, you don't see persistent activity. If it's above a threshold level, you start to see persistent activity. So that may be, my take about that. Just to add that it could also be there's something else, such as neuromodulation, which may be somewhat different. So, for example, dopamine modulation may be, say, somewhat more prominent in the prefrontal cortex than in early sensory systems. for example, that could make a difference as well. But I would say again, it's a matter of quantitative differences leading to qualitative differences.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's still a very much cortex-centered view. So does that mean that you would be making the strong statement that, okay, working memory can be fully realized by cortical circuits and does not depend on subcortical activity beyond possibly some forms of neuromodulation? So
yeah, we don't know much about that. I guess there's one thing certainly people think for why subcortical structures might be important. That is gating. So you don't want any sensory stimulus coming into your brain to be stored in working memory, right? So basically, you somehow have to gate what really is behaviorally important that you have to maintain internally, let's say in the prefrontal cortex. And that seems to depend on basal ganglia. There's this idea that, basal ganglia, for example, through the thalamus can gate what signal is important and what is not. At least, part of the gating functions is dependent on basal ganglia.
okay.
Yeah.
So
it could also be that persistent activity itself, right, may in part depend on reverberation in a bigger loop involving subcortical system. But for that, I mean, people speculate about that for a long time. As far as I know, we do not yet have very strong evidence for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then the core ingredients of your model will be, let's say, recurrently coupled excitatory circuits with, let's say, some inhibitory add-ons to get selectivity. And this will be, I think, some summary of a cortical circuit. And then this and this would then project downstream to, let's say, other subcortical structures to trigger action, as in, for instance, your standard two-choice saccade-based tasks. It would be like the choice aspects would happen in this cortical model, and then the saccade would be triggered by, let's say, superior colliculus, to which this decision-making system would project. So is that an assumption you really would like to insist on, that, let's say, these action elements are extracortical, and that more the sensory-based and the rule-based aspects are processed at the cortical level?
Well, that I guess depends. So in a way, saccade is special, right? So if you talk about manual responses, then, maybe parts of the motor cortex are the command centers. And so that would be kind of downstream system form, cumulative decision circuits where information are integrated, maybe a choice is produced. So in that case, then even the, at least the part of the response generation is occurring inside the cortex. Always together with basal ganglia and some others like thalamus. But in that case, a lot of things may happen in the cortex as well. Okay.
So your the approach, I mean, also given your background in physics, you have used one of these tools that has been important to theoretical neuroscience from physics of, let's say, attractor networks to analyze this model. So why is the notion of an attractor network helping you to understand these prefrontal, these cortical dynamics?
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I like to say, especially to experimentalists, that the word attractor networks seem to provoke certain reactions in some people, right? So I would sometimes start out by saying that attractor dynamics is not like a black hole. So it's not something that's very rigid, that if you are in an attractor state, then it's like you're sucked in, you cannot get out, and it's very rigid kind of thing. Attractor states are simply relatively stable states. That's all. It could even be something, more than just a steady state. For example, you could have chaotic attractors where you have a lot of temporal dynamics going on inside that, chaotic attractor state, right? That's one thing. The other thing is that any inputs or neuromodulation can easily change, if you like, the landscape of attracted states. So you can easily actually control, manipulate, the landscape of multiple attracted states. So, simply, as I was saying, attracted states are simply relatively stable states. And if you want to describe mathematically what is a persistent activity, right? Then it's natural to think about that as a relatively stable state. That's all, right? So as a result, the concept of attracted states is really natural. People still debate about the actual dynamical structures of persistent activity that should be described well by attracted networks, but that's, I think, a separate issue from the more general question whether attracted networks is the right framework or not to describe persistent activity.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I could argue that in some sense any system that will show some persistence at whatever spatial temporal scale you want to express this, I can redescribe in terms of an attracted network. So the risk might then be that the framework of an attractor is so, let's say, super powerful that it might not give you much leverage with respect to a specific phenomenon. So what's the leverage it has given you to really understand prefrontal cortex?
Sorry, I'm not sure I really understand the.
Well, it's very simple.
Well, yes,
In some sense, you could argue that if you look at the nervous system, you will find at many different levels, you will find persistent states in some temporal window. It can be a microsecond. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
In all those cases, I could step in with an attractor network formulation and say, you see, it's an attractor because the system in some way is returning to this state, and then I define that state in some way. Right. So that means the attractor framework is super powerful, and that you can describe anything with it you want as long as there's some persistence in the system in some definition of its possible states. So
I see. So what's special about, say, prefrontal cortex?
Exactly. Why does it give you leverage to understand prefrontal cortex?
Right. I guess the important thing is that you have multiple attracted states at the same time. See, if you think about, if you want to design a working memory system, it basically is a system with multiple states so that you can switch on and off between different states, right? And that may not be so universal in different systems. For example, you don't need and you don't want, I argue, multiple states in not necessarily in early sensory systems, for example, right? And so even if you have some persistency, the question is whether you have this ability to go back and forth between many different states with very brief inputs, right? Does that make sense? So that
Sure.
seemed to be the distinction between what you want for a working memory system versus a sensory processing device.
Okay, so you're saying the framework of attractors gives you leverage in this case because actually you're looking at a system that can be in a large number of possible states, and this is an efficient way to describe these.
That's right. Yeah. And the persistency should be at the long time scale compared to the time constant you have in the system, right? Like, milliseconds versus tens of milliseconds by biophysical time constant. Let me also, just briefly say that as I was, discussing in my lecture, that in fact, fast switches turned out to be not the right conceptualization in the model I described. So you also have very slow transients too, and that not just steady states. And those slow transients, like a gradual ramping activity, turns out to be very good, computational mean to say integrate information in decision making. So this is kind of unusual type of attracted networks where you at the same time have multiple stable states, but you also have this ability to, to have very slow transients for time integration.
Okay, but do you see that as an intrinsic property of these circuits, or as an add-on that might be supported by a different substrate.
So at least for the mechanism we found in the model, it's the same circuit.
Mm-hmm.
So the same circuit, because the recurrent dynamics is mediated by kind of slower cellular mechanism, you can have both slow transients and multiple states.
Okay.
Yeah. Whether, in the brain, those two things, actually there is evidence, I guess, at the single neuron level that in the brain, those two things can happen at least in same circuits, right?
Yes.
And actually very commonly you observe, decision-related neural signals in a decision task and working memory-related signals in a working memory task in very different experiments done in different labs, but from the same cortical areas.
Right.
Just you have a shared mechanism.
Yeah. Okay. Although you can never exclude that these might be interspersed circuits that perform different functions, no?
Right.
In theory.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So, but before we move then to this issue of timing and decision making, another issue around attractor networks is that in order to be, let's say, a certified and card-carrying member of the club of attractor networks, you must satisfy certain minimal criteria. Like, for instance, under perturbation, you must resort to the same attractive state, and so on. So, are you sure that the frontal cortical networks you look at, do satisfy all these conditions?
Well, I guess that's rather difficult to test, especially in behaving animals or behaving primates, especially. So I imagine that if, people now are making efforts to develop maybe simpler, model systems like rodents, if you can design a good, say, working memory or decision-making task, it's probably more likely you can really go down into microcircuit mechanisms and get into more detailed information. However, you can, do certain experimental manipulations to test some model predictions. So, for example, as I showed that, mentioned earlier that we found that reverberation should be slow. In particular, it probably depends on a particular receptor, NMDA receptors at the recurrent synapses, right? And we, in collaboration with Amy Anston at Yale, actually we tested this idea in behaving monkeys in a working memory task using a technique called iontophoresis to inject the drug locally onto neurons you record from. Right, so you see persistent activity in those neurons in the prefrontal cortex of behaving monkey, and then when you apply the drug, that blocks NMDA receptors, you actually see that persistent activity goes away. So that's in my mind a very direct confirmation that NMDA receptors that are slow, mediating slow reverberation, are critical for persistent activity.
Okay, yes, I see that. But then I could argue, well, but maybe you're blocking the NMDA receptors at the part of the thalamic projections. How can you exclude that?
No, you cannot. That's right. But at least we can say it are likely to be kind of intrinsic synapses rather than, synapses coming from external stimulation. Because this is during working memory, during the delay when there's no direct sensory stimulus, right? So to address your question, you can do a different set of experiments, but not with monkey. So with rodent, you can do in vitro slices, right? And actually we have done in collaboration with another group, by Wenjing Gao in Philadelphia, where you do prefrontal cortical slices directly. You can look at, NMDA or AMPA receptor mediated transmission between two cells, neighboring neurons. So there's really local connections between two neurons and show how much NMDA you have in, at this, very local synapses, in prefrontal neurons. And you can compare that with the same kind of peer recordings in primary sensory system, you see a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's also consistent.
Right. So with these experiments.
So that would be really cortical, right? Local.
Yes. But with the antiphoresis experiment, basically what you're saying is, well, this makes it plausible that the memory state is implemented by a recurrent or reverberating circuit. Right? But in some sense, what we then still don't know is whether it really can be called an attractor or not. So would you argue that, for instance, these micro-stimulation experiments that have been performed, like in frontal eye fields, that would sort of bias decision making of an animal, would you take that as corroborative evidence of having attractor states? Or would that be the kind of way to get at that question?
Well, I think in order to go further along the question what you suggest, we should propose something very well defined that's a alternative to attractive model, right? And otherwise, it's hard to say how do you prove or disprove the attractor network paradigm. So I guess one alternative is slow transients. Just because of some cellular or whatever, biophysical process with very slow time constant, right? And so as a result, in response to a transient stimulus, it just keep going for a long time on a time scale of many seconds, right? So that's something we can try to, right, contrast with attractor network. And I'm sure slow processes are playing a role. The question is whether it's the workhorse, the main thing, right? I do see a possible problem with a mechanism that's completely based on very slow process, because if you have a system with intrinsically very slow time constant, you would have a hard time to, change the system with brief input, right? Because the time constant is so short, so long, you have to use very long inputs to do anything with the system. So switch on and off becomes a problem.
Right.
Yeah. So, but maybe, people can think about a clever way to really propose very, clearly defined alternatives, right? And then try to decide.
Right. So what was very exciting about your proposal is that you also made the argument, look, I can represent the memory state. I can represent the decision making by switching between my different attractors. But on top of that, I can also capture the kind of ramping functions that have to do with the reaction times as observed in prefrontal cortex, right? Where you see that, okay, these neurons that seem to correlate with a decision ramp more slowly when you have long reaction times, and they ramp very fast when you have a fast reaction time. So how could that drop out of your model so easily? What was the trick there? Why did that work?
Well, I guess the main thing is this idea of slow reverberation, I guess, and that was a surprise to us. A priori, as I was saying, working memory itself, in principle, right? If you're an engineer, you think about how to design a working memory device, you could say that can be done by faster switches. But when you try to do that with neurons and the realistic synaptic connections, it turns out that the system is very unstable because of the strong feedback, machinery in the system. And one way to solve that is to say positive feedback needs to be slow relative to negative feedback. And that was kind of forced on us, on us. So we say, we have to have a working memory mechanism with slow reverberation rather than very fast positive feedback. And from there, it turns out, it becomes easy. So this slow reverberation turns out to be exactly what you need to get a slow ramping activity in decision. I thought it's quite nice. Yeah.
But now, one question I would have there is, in some sense, in this manipulation, you could have a confound that what we are detecting is based on moving dots, essentially, and it's about the coherence of the moving dots that you make your decisions. So I could argue, look, if I have these prefrontal neurons that are sensitive to the moving dots, then if they have an orientation tuning, then of course I'm driving them more effectively if I have coherent movement in my scene than if I drive all these neurons incoherently. So that basically means per unit time they get less energy, and therefore as a result I'll be ramping up more slowly or faster, you see. And this then also exactly correlates with the task conditions. So imagine I would change the task now that the animal has to make a decision based on, let's say, when there's incoherent movement, it gets reward and it should ignore coherent movement. So I change the contingency.
Yeah.
Would you predict the model would still work, or would you have to add a new feature?
So what we added, we do need to add something in that case, that is reward-dependent plasticity. So in that case, you have to learn what are the potential outcomes from your choice options, right? And that we believe is done through learning. That depends on, say, reward. Okay. I think what you're pointing earlier at is the confound that maybe a slow ramp just corresponds to weaker input, right? But in part it's true. So basically, you probably need to integrate more over time if your input, your evidence is weaker. But it's not just that, because, for example, we showed that if you have more options to consider, then the reaction times are also slower. And that in part is because you have this competition between neuron pools selected for, say, 4 or 5 options. And that involves inhibition because it's a competition mediated by inhibition. That also slows down the ramping activity. So you can also show nicely, something that people see in psychology. The more options you have to consider, the slower will be reaction time, for example.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. So, but then the other aspect that I was curious about, if you look at the model, it's also an issue we discussed earlier, the interpretation of this prefrontal cortical function, also in the literature at large, it's in the end very much a labeled line kind of system. I have choice options, the choice options depend on certain sensory cues, and in V1, by magic, they just come together in these units, or in my attractor network, in my current network, and now I can start to make decisions with them. But you could then, of course, pose the question, it's something that's a form of the symbol grounding problem. Okay, where do these labeled lines come from? And should I really assume that these are labeled lines, that, let's say, your prefrontal cortex has all these labeled lines projecting into it from other areas, representing all possible cues you can ever encounter, or you have ever encountered in the world, combined with all possible actions that you can ever trigger in response to these cues? But that would be the labeled line view. So do you think that that's a reasonable assumption, or do we have to get away from it in some way?
Right. So I guess you're totally right. We have, been focusing on certain elementary and fundamental machineries about working memory and decision making without, paying too much attention on real life stimuli, right? And how do we really process real life stimuli? So I guess in my mind, to go forward in that direction, we have to understand better how objects are recognized and represented in the brain. And I could imagine, so for example, in the inferior temporal cortex, there we don't really understand yet how we recognize objects fully. So it could be delay line, but it could be something more than that, right? People talk about grandmother cells. That's more like delay line, I guess, in your terminology. But, or maybe something more dynamic, right? We don't know yet, what that is. But, to answer your question, I can envision that, starting with the building blocks, basically the elementary machinery, we kind of have some insights into, for working memory system. We can envision to connect that with something like, a sensory visual system, including IT, for example, and see how the interaction between a working memory system and the rest, the posterior part of the visual system together in a larger scale brain system, to carry out more realistic kind of representation and the working memory. And I do think that's a major challenge in the field. How we have been focused on mostly local circuits, right? And we have to come up with a theoretical framework and new concepts perhaps to understand large-scale brain system with interacting parts.
Mm-hmm. Right? Exactly. But so there are also so to go in that direction, if you look at the physiology on prefrontal cortex, these classic experiments by Assad, Miller, and so on, in the end, you look at populations of neurons that actually have a very broad range of representations of cues, actions, and their combinations following different rules. So could you then imagine that maybe you have, let's say, more specialization in these prefrontal circuits, that some neurons, let's say, contribute to cue information, others the action information, and then in their interaction, they will build up this, what you would call the attractor, representing this key state in which you want to make your decisions. Would that be a reasonable alternative?
Well, actually, so we have done more recent work with Stefano Fusi and Mattia, his graduate student. That work suggests, this is a computational work, suggests that in fact the neuron signals in the prefrontal cortex probably should have a lot of mixed selectivity. So a given neuron would be, activated to different degrees by a combination of many different things, including, sensory stimuli, internal representation of behavior rules, and maybe some control signals all together. So my view is that neurons are probably not dedicated to one thing only, especially in the prefrontal cortex, maybe in contrast to early sensory systems. And there, it's very likely that, there's a lot of mixed selectivity. And so that, neuron groups are, if you like, coding things according to a combinatory code. That will be maybe a very good way to be able to combine information, right? Another thing that's special about prefrontal cortex is that it gets inputs from many, many different areas, right? And that also speaks to the fact that, neural inputs also are kind of, coming from a lot of convergent, divergent pathways.
Right.
Yeah.
So then on top of that, where do you see these models go? What's the next challenge for you in this model?
So I guess briefly I can see several directions. Number one is to see if the kind of models we build can be kind of and those are building blocks of cognition. I like to call this, right, local circuit mechanisms and building blocks for cognition. So the question is, can you extend this kind of approach at least to more complex behaviors, more complex functions, such as task switching, right, and or rule-based behavior, right? So that's one. Number two, I just mentioned earlier, can we develop theory and, computational mechanisms and the principles for large-scale brain systems rather than just local circuits? And third is real-life situation, that definitely will challenge our kind of models in a very big way. So, we want to see if, the insights from those kind of models are really useful for, our behavior in the face of a natural kind of environment. Yeah.
So then, what I also realized is that recently you have become more interested in, let's say, brain rhythms and brain oscillations. And you wrote a rather impressive review article on these oscillations recently. Why? How is this related to the attraction network? So is this really a new chapter?
So this is a very interesting topic. I think more and more people are interested in this. Really, very active field. In people from very different disciplines, like systems neuroscientists, as well as actually many people in the clinical field. People feel like this neuron synchrony, might be a way to look at, for example, interactions between brain systems, right? So, related to the large scale dynamics type of issues. We have worked a lot on, the mechanisms of synchrony and possible functions. It emerges naturally in recurrent networks, basically. Okay. But it's still rather controversial, especially in terms of functional implications. In part, I think it's because you do see often evidence of synchrony and oscillations with measurements like EEG or local field potential. On the other hand, single neurons are very stochastic. Even single neuron populations are very variable. Okay. And so those two things don't seem to, fit together. Okay. That's, I think, part of the reason people feel like, it's hard to understand. How do you explain those two things in the same framework? And also, if the neuron operation is very stochastic, then how much, right, in terms of degree, synchrony is really there on top of the stochasticity? And if it's not big, right, if you have some measurement about synchrony, and if it's still a few percent of the signal you see, why it should be the main focus, for example. Okay, I'm raising these questions without knowing the exact answers to those questions. So, in this review, for example, I try to discuss how you can reconcile these views. Okay, and the general take, I guess we don't definitely know is the final answer, but the general take is that you maybe it's better to think about the role of synchrony in a framework, in terms of neural correlations, which we know are very important, right? Neural correlations in time, for example, are important for plasticity, spike time independent plasticity, right? It may be even important to generate a stochasticity. It sounds like a bit paradoxical, but we know that because a given neuron receives a lot of inputs, you can average out noise. And if, on the other hand, neurons are correlated weakly, they cannot average out noise. And so maybe correlation itself is important to generate a stochasticity, right? So, and that in turn, of course, can be functionally very important. So, to understand the different aspects of dynamics in the recurrent network is a big challenge. So I guess that's a big reason that we are interested in synchrony.
Very good. So then to finish up, two questions. So, coming from physics, going to neuroscience, attractive networks, and actually now moving towards brain oscillations, large-scale understanding of the brain. If you would have to stipulate a law that we should all follow in studying the brain, so what would be the Xiao-Jing Wang law?
That's a tough one. Well, let me phrase it this way. I do think that trying to understand neural circuits of cognition is really very exciting, challenging thing. And that would help to unify cognitive sciences and quote unquote hardcore neurobiology, which right now are still kind of separated. And from what we learned, at least, the key is slow reverberation balanced by inhibition. And so again, quantitative differences can give you surprisingly new qualitatively different functions and computations. And that'll be, it's probably known from the theory of dynamical systems field, but it should be a very big part of our efforts to understand cognitive circuits.
Okay, so Xiao-Jing Wang law is slow reverberation does the trick.
That's right.
Very good.
For the time being.
Okay. And then my last question is if so, I'm gonna go visit you 5 years from now at Yale. I'm gonna ask you then 5 years from now, like, look, 5 years back you gave me this one prediction that you would have believed in. So how did it pan out? Was it false or true? What's this one prediction you'll be willing to stick your neck out for today?
Well, I guess still slow reverberation. There are many other smaller predictions that came out of the model. Just one more example is, this is a very specific example, but I think it's quite impressive. It turns out to be correct. That is, you find some scale invariance of reaction times. That's at the behavior level. It's a psychological law, really. Very quantitative, very beautiful law in psychology that you can explain with a neural circuit model mechanism in terms of stochastic neural dynamics, right? And that can be proved using neurophysiology. I thought that would be really quite important, really to relate what you see in neurons in the recurrent circuit and what you see at the behavior level.
Yeah, but that prediction has already come out, so I want a new one I can come and hassle you with 5 years from now.
That has not been done yet.
Of course. The thing is, I want you to now take this risk that you might be wrong.
So I guess, slow evaporation, but I guess how to prove that's wrong is
it's a safe prediction.
Right.
Well,
you also want to have a big one, right? Or just not just any
whatever you feel comfortable with. How about the following? Why don't you put some boundaries on slow? So, in what range of frequencies are we talking about for slow reverberation?
Yeah, so that, actually open up a whole can of worms or open a big door because, when you make decisions, you can integrate information over many timescales. So, right. So in the brain, supposedly there are machineries that allow you to integrate information, right? So you can talk about integration over many seconds or even minutes. So we don't know on that time scale what really is going on in the brain. Let's see, what prediction that can be proven to be wrong? Let's make that very specific. I guess I bet NMDA receptors and recurrent synapses inside, cognitive type neuron cortical circuits are the key for slow integration on a time scale of a second or so.
Perfect. Xiao-Jing Wang, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.